Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, welcome to you all to the program. I'm Adnan Hussein, historian of the medieval Mediterranean and Islamicate world. And I have a wonderful episode for you today that hopefully will also go out on Guerrilla History podcast. I'm a co-host of that podcast. Henry unfortunately can't be with us today, but we will have this on both the audio feeds for the Adnan Hussein Show and Guerrilla History, as well as, of course, on video on the YouTube channel for the Adnan Hussein Show. But before I introduce the topic and my guest today, I just wanted to say, of course, you know, if you listen to this channel, that I used to do a podcast called The Majlis, which was sponsored by the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project at Queen's University, where I teach. But in October of last year, 2024, when I was prevented from being able to record Francesca Albanese's lecture, we had invited her. I had her permission, the organizers' permissions to do so. The university administration prevented me from recording it. And at that point, I decided that it was important and necessary in order to preserve the kinds of conversations we're going to be having now with scholars, with activists, with historians about the very serious and important issues that we're just dealing with in the world without censorship or pressure being put on us, that I had to start this channel. So I just would like you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it to your friends. We're going to be having analysis by a scholarly expert that you're not going to hear on a lot of, mainstream platforms, even many platforms on the alternative left media. So I really want you to get this out there. And of course, if you can support us for the production costs and other things, you're welcome to do so. Patreon.com/Adnan Hussein. And of course, Guerrilla History, it's patreon.com/guerrilla history. So you can support us on those things. But the main and important thing is that this knowledge be available freely and to the public. So please do share it. Okay, well, why do we need to have this episode in particular? Well, I mean, as those who have been following the genocide and changes geopolitically taking place in West Asia as a consequence of and connected to Israel's genocidal assault upon Gaza, they would be very well aware that in December of 2024, the Syrian government was overthrown in very short order by a motley group of led principally by an organization called HTS. What's actually? It's like Harakat Tahrir Sham. Yeah. So HTS, Harakat Tahrir Sham. And of course, we're going to talk a lot more about, these groups and what happened as a consequence. But it put the kind of question of Syria back in the forefront of thinking about regional analysis. And there's been a lot of misinformation. It's been an issue that has divided many people in the pro-Palestine solidarity movement. And so I've had other episodes where we've discussed some of this, but now I think it's really important to have some serious scholarly analysis and attention, and particularly historical context and analysis. So for that reason, we've brought on a previous guest to Guerrilla History, but the first time guest to the Adnan Hussein Show component, and that is Patrick Higgins, who is received his PhD from University of Houston's Center for Arab Studies. He is a co-editor of a wonderful website called Liberated Texts. All of you should go and check that out and be a regular reader on that website. And he's also a member of a new organization that is doing very exciting work that we hope will have an impact. That is the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. Patrick, it's so great to have you on. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me, Adnan. I appreciate it.
Well, it's good to talk with you particularly about this because, as I mentioned in sort of my introductory remarks here, I think historical analysis would be beneficial in trying to situate and contextualize what's been happening. And of course, there have been so many events and things changing that it's hard to keep abreast of it. And of course, we don't have the full picture for everything. But you in particular published a very important and interesting article that I want to recommend to listeners that we're going to discuss a little bit called Gunning for Damascus. And I guess the rest of the title was the U.S. War Against the Syrian Arab Republic. And it was published in 2023 in Middle East Critique, a wonderful journal that I also recommend to everyone. It's free and available. It's open source. And in this, you dealt with a lot of the issues that had come out and the narratives that had come out in trying to characterize or portray the so-called Syrian civil war and put it in a deeper kind of context, and to suggest that there was a longer history of U.S. interference and intervention and hostility to the Syrian Arab Republic. And so I wondered if maybe you could take us through what you think are some of the most important outcomes and lessons of that history that might be useful when we start talking about more contemporary events in Syria. But where was you? A lot of people think that it's really a question of what happened in 2011. And forward. What would you say about where we need to locate a longer practice of interference with and hostility towards Syria in U.S. policy?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Thank you for bringing up that article, which I think was a stage of an ongoing work of progress of my interest in Syria. And I had entered that subject matter initially, for my dissertation. I had set out to study Palestine and Palestinian liberation. And what I increasingly found was that in understanding the history of 20th century West Asia, understanding the history of national liberation movements there, Palestine provides a significant entry point to that history, because this is the main site of continuing direct conflict between imperialism and national liberation, say Arab national liberation, within which I would situate Palestine. So that provides one entry point. But what I increasingly found was through these overlaps of Palestinian and Syrian history, that Syria, if you enter this history through Syria, it tells a very important story insofar as, I'd say the main difference between the situation of Palestine and Syria is that Syria was able to secure for a period of time a relatively, an emphasis, of course, on relatively sovereign base within West Asia, whereas the Palestinian liberation movement has largely gone without a state. So I wanted to, I thought it was important to look at the overlaps and then compare and contrast these histories as well. And what I found was, of course, there's this saying that Syria is the beating heart of Arabism. And this is in part due to the geographic location of Syria and West Asia as the great connector of various liberation movements that had developed in the 20th century that were trying to connect their activities after this region through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This is in 1916, wherein the French and the British colonialists severed these lands and erected borders that previously had not existed. And this presented a problem for the cause of Arab national liberation having to achieve unification. So all of these efforts that proceeded in the 20th century, which I addressed somewhat in that article, had to proceed through Syria. Now, to go to the part of the question where where do we trace the beginnings of interference? Well, I situate that the history of imperialist attempts to overturn Syrian sovereignty within the U.S.-led world system, just because the main power today is the United States imperialism. And so I start my history in that piece at 1945, which I think is something that yields new insights into what exactly has been going on here. And I draw out, I think, two things: the elements of revolution, and then dialectically linked on the other side, the elements of counter-revolution. Now, dealing with the latter, counter-revolutions, the United States had an interest, and this is something that I found when I started to go through old documents from the late 1940s, that the first few leaders in Syria, after Syria declared independence from French colonialism in 1946, had been threatened in various ways by the U.S., or the U.S. talked about them in a way that essentially saying they have to be dealt with, because they had established first of all, a republic. So this automatically contrasts it from the monarchies that existed in the region. And through the republic, I think stronger sentiments of Arab nationalism had prevailed in a way that it didn't in Jordan. And so when they created this relatively sovereign base, they were able to support early on the Palestinian, let's say the Arab Liberation Army, which was a volunteer-run guerrilla force that was trying to stop the Zionist takeover and conquest of neighboring Palestine. So the United States had been, many of its officials had been saying behind the scenes, look, they're this meddling force operating out of Syria. Syria is allowing their territory to be used in this way, and something needs to be done about this to bring this to a conclusion. And even subsequently, for instance, the CIA helped engineer this coup in 1949 against the president that was hosting this Arab Liberation Army. And even after that point, subsequent coups that take place, you see the United States take an attitude that, oh, well, we don't want to provide them, even though we've sort of gotten what we wanted to some extent. We don't really want to provide them with any kind of serious weaponry, because we're concerned that they might use this weaponry against Israel. And so you already had, I'd say, very intense U.S. investment in Israel that goes before, it starts even before the foundation of the State of Israel formally in May of 1948, where a lot of the engineers of U.S. policy, figures like James McDonald, Bartley Crum, you could look these people up, some of them had direct involvement with the Zionist movement, that is, raising awareness for the Zionist cause to establish the State of Israel. So that's on the side of counter-revolution, the origins of that, as far as it relates to the U.S. involvement. And then on the side of revolution, what I found interesting, important about Syria, and continue to find important, is that the Ba'ath Party, when it comes to power, it becomes influential before it formally comes to power in 1963. The Ba'ath Party had led a revolution that was, that I would call a revolution as I understand the term. And I would contrast it very much from the Tekfiri-fronted takeover of Syria we're witnessing right now, for which I think the word counter-revolution is actually more apt. And to put it in general terms, what I mean is, some of the main policies that the Syrian Arab Republic had committed itself to prior to December of 2024, when we saw this overthrow, had been the result not of just this or that leader's kind of their very narrow, referring here to Assad, very narrow calculations, but actually had been embedded within the state structure from successive waves of revolution. So that begins, first of all, with the independence movement of 1946, but then subsequently of the Ba'ath Party's policies that begin in the 1960s, where their philosophy was they begin from the standpoint of nationalists. Okay, so if you look at some of the founding figures like Zaki Arsuzi or Michel Aflaq, people like this, the founding philosophers of the Ba'ath Party, they had strong criticisms of some socialist movements that had existed, of the Soviet Union, so on and so forth, because of things like dialectical materialism. They held a place for spirituality, and also because of their emphasis specifically on nationalism. But what you begin to see if you follow the process of the development of the Ba'ath Party in the 1960s is, first of all, I'll just give your audience a brief timeline here. In 1958, the Ba'ath Party had, they previously voted for an attempt to have a merger between Syria and Nasser's Egypt. And this is going to be the stepping stone to broader Arab unification, which is, I look at as a regional form of internationalism, okay? To bring together the resources of all these Arab states and centrally plan it. That only lasts until about 1961, when there's a rightist coup in September of that year that is dissatisfied. There are different factions dissatisfied with this union for different reasons. Some of them because of socialist reform, so there's this bourgeois angst against it. And then some of them actually from the left, where they think that Nasser was not granting enough autonomy for Syria to make its own to have input into its own developmental decisions, okay? So this coup was won from the right. Fast forward to 1963, you have in February of that year, a Ba'athist coup that takes place in Iraq. And after that, this, because it was the left wing of the party that took over, you have, in a month later, March 8th in 1963, a left faction of the Ba'ath Party is able to gain ground in Syria with a coup there, okay? Subsequently from there, in 1966, of February of that year, there is another coup that takes place from further to the left within the Ba'ath Party. And if you follow the documents of the party at this time, you see a gradual, I want to say, approach towards an internationalist, and I would even argue materialist position. So there's a couple documents I think people could find in English that I would recommend people look at. First of all, there is the Party Congress statement of 1963. In 1964, you can find a provisional Syrian constitution. And then in 1965, there's another Party Congress statement that's put out. And if you look at the language of these documents, you'll see that there's a powerful commitment to Palestine, where they say this is actually going to be the liberation of Palestine is going to be the most important priority of the party. There's a commitment to socialism that is very explicit. And their argument is, even though they come out of nationalism, that in order to actually fulfill the aims of national liberation, they must be socialist, because their experience of capitalism was that all of the enterprises are owned by foreign companies. So there's no way to actually decide our own development unless the state nationalizes these main holdings. There is a commitment then to Article 30 of the 1963 or 1964 Constitution that people look up. It's essentially what you would describe as land to the tiller, the kind of land reforms you would see in places like China, Korea, and Vietnam. And there's talk about making links with Africa and Pan-Africanist movement, and doing so through Islam, to say that we have this connection to these countries. Strong, robust criticisms of apartheid South Africa, which they compare to Israel. And so my argument is, even after subsequent waves of we could call it, setbacks and so on and so forth, but I want to emphasize some of the way that this history is viewed. For instance, when Assad in 1970, in November of that year, declares this emergency session where he carries out a coup against the left of the party that had been in command since 1966. Some of this is okay. Another guy comes in and he sort of pulls back these revolutionary impulses of the Syrian project. I argue that is somewhat of a simplification for a couple of reasons. That the structural reasons for those rollbacks that take place was really impelled by the 1967 war, and that it was seen like the left wing of the party was discredited because they had prioritized becoming part of the Palestinian People's War in places like Jordan. And it was also because of that there was a turn in strategy. So it's not like these commitments all of a sudden evaporated from the Syrian project. There was a different strategy, which we may disagree with. And so, in many ways, I do find things to disagree with. But it's not like these commitments to Palestine all of a sudden evaporated. They pursued different paths for it. And so these are some of the main points that I was trying to make in that article.
Yeah, okay, that's very helpful to have that survey, because I think what you've emphasized in this account is that an independent sovereign Syria was seen as a problem for U.S. imperial designs and priorities in the region because, one, it was explicitly opposing the Zionist project and presented a potential military or security threat to the Zionist state of Israel, and two, because the independent sovereign Syria had, through the particular social and political orientations of the forces that had secured its sovereignty against French colonialism in the Mandate period and in the post-war period, remained committed despite various changes that might take place with different regimes coming in, maintained a commitment to a certain level, not only that first goal, but the second goal of development, independent development on behalf of the people, of the region, and with some various progressive commitments. Those may have varied to some extent here and there, but by and large, this remains a pretty stable kind of orientation of the Syrian state. So that's kind of the background that I think the rest of the article, you go into some great detail, in fact, actually, about what some of the policies of the U.S. were and how they did interfere at various times through covert and more overt, methods. But basically, it was seen as oppositional, that Syria was a problem for the U.S. sort of program for the region, particularly during the Cold War, and particularly because Syria became increasingly aligned with Second World, as something you didn't necessarily go into, but obviously they were quite willing to receive technical support and investment from, the Soviet Union and other allies within, the kind of communist bloc and so on. And that put them very much in what was sometimes called the Arab Cold War, in opposition to other regimes that had been established in the post-colonial period that were more Western-oriented and friendly, principally these monarchies. And so you had mentioned that Syria was a republic. That's something that distinguished it, like, the Ba'ath Revolution in Iraq, against Hashemite, kingdom, like, the Free Officers Revolution with Nasser's Egypt, against, the royalist, administration that had been sponsored by the British. And so there is a kind of way in which Syria is kind of structurally outside of the U.S. orbit, and that's a problem that U.S. policy addresses itself to. So that's extremely helpful. What I'm wondering is, if we come to sort of the more kind of contemporary period, and look at the context for what's happening in the region, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, how would you characterize, what the key kinds of developments are? Of course, we're skipping over a lot. There's been, the initiation of the global war on terror. I mean, I think you may want to mention something about that, because that's, of course, part of the important background for which groups end up being sponsored, and so forth, these jihadi takfiri groups, which is often seen as, that the global war on terror, was somehow out of alignment with, with that process, because it was targeting supposedly, these sorts of groups, and which also tended to make people believe and imagine that these were couldn't be, supported by the United States, right? A lot of people thought, well, these are, kind of forces that are not aligned with the United States. So maybe it is worth sort of talking a little bit about Syria's position in, the kind of global war on terror in the 2000s. But I guess the main point is that how do you think the so-called Arab Spring and the readjustments and alignments that take place across the region there need to be analyzed in order to put into context, what happens and what takes place in Syria? Maybe less about what takes place, but more about how it's received and propagandized, in the kind of Western media globally.
I think so. There's this period of time, let's say, between the 1970s and the 1990s, wherein the resistance movement, the nature and character of it throughout West Asia, is to Zionism, and which is part of U.S. control of the region. It starts to change. It's in flux. That is the position of the Soviet Union as it begins to weaken globally as well as regionally. The explicit character of that left-wing revolution is sometimes challenged within anti-imperialist circles. So what I find important about Syria in that general picture, so let's just put, for example, Syria develops a conflict with its next door neighbor, Iraq, even though they both have Ba'athist governments for reasons that I won't get into right now. They develop very severe conflict, these two factions of the party. Syria, however, because of these structural commitments, let's say to the Palestinian cause within its state structure, and just to say what I mean by that, there's a relationship between the socialist development in Syria and this commitment to the Palestinian cause. These things aren't two separate categories. The path of development informs this commitment. And what I mean by that is, say when you have agricultural collectives in the countryside, as well as these labor unions that existed within the state in Syria. And then you also have a structure called the Progressive National Front, which included, Communist Party, so on and so forth. Now, the criticism about this kind of governing structure of Assad is that, well, he was bringing in the left wing so as to sort of co-opt them. And there's an element of truth to that, but at the same time, that means that there's still a left wing present within the state, even if might not be as far left if some of these parties were in command, right? So if you have these sort of structures that exist in the state, that allows for a certain kind of input from the population that I don't think has many analogs, say, in U.S. capitalism. So the existence of an agricultural cooperative that meets regularly with representatives from the Ba'ath Party, they can go and talk about what's on their mind. And there is the existence of a kind of social pact that would exist within those meetings, even though I think those, as I talk about in that article, the social pact starts to break down in the 1990s. So there I draw a link between why the sentiment of the general population on Palestine and why the government maintains this position. So to go back to what I was saying regionally about the development in the changes of the resistance movement regionally, is that even when these changes start to take place, the Syrian state participates in new ways for maintaining the existence of a resistance network to Zionism. So in 1979, the Syrian Arab Republic makes a decision that is somewhat controversial at the time because it's foregoing Arabist orthodoxy to start to develop friendly relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They're basically saying, okay, there's this common interest in anti-Zionism, we'll develop these relations. And so what this means is after 1991, where Syria ends up being impacted in devastating ways by the overthrow and dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Syrian state still is able to find new ways to support various networks of resistance. So this gives rise to what is known today as the axis of resistance. And it combines, in some ways, the materiel and also there's training that goes on and so on and so forth to support anti-Zionist militia in places like southern Lebanon, in places like Palestine. And it bridges actually the old secular nationalist projects of resistance with the new Islamic resistance that you would find in those places. And so what this actually does is it keeps a anti-Zionist resistance structure alive at a time where even because of the fall, the overthrow of the Soviet Union, even the Palestinian national movement is making significant concessions through things like Oslo in 1993. So it keeps it alive. And I think that was very important and it signaled to the United States that we need to make new, in order to maintain the grip on the region, we need to make new investments in destroying this new structure that's kind of rising out of the ashes of the old Soviet Union or the Soviet Union umbrella within West Asia. So these structures were on the target list of the United States government from the get-go. After September of 2001, that sometimes when U.S. officials say what their intention is, you just they're actually, sometimes they're engaged in deception, but sometimes they make it clear what they intend to do. And I would, compare that right now when Trump goes out and says, I intend to ethnically cleanse, or we intend to get rid of the population of Gaza. And then some people will months later figure out what they're trying to do in Gaza. So, well, this guy actually said it out loud, right? So similarly, after September of 2001, the United States, including the Bush administration, when he was espousing rhetoric about a so-called axis of evil, was talking openly about the need to target Syria as part of the list of states that they were going after. And we can see now that the Arab nationalist republics that took an anti-Zionist policy have all been targeted. As far as the republics, there's this exceptional case of Egypt, but if you leave that aside, Yemen was a Marxist government for a long time, and that was targeted in various ways. We see Libya in 2011, and Iraq before that in 2003, and then eventually comes back around to Syria. So they said this was their intention, and this is what we're actually seeing play out. It's not a coincidence that these are the states and societies that are on fire. And what I often say about this is that in any given society, you are going to find people discontent with the prevailing system, with the prevailing government, and so on and so forth. And Syria had its own particular movement that from the beginning of the establishment of Ba'ath Party power in Syria had been vehemently opposed to it, and would elements of which would overthrow that government if they could. But the key point there is if they could, right? Which means that you need money, you need weapons and other forms in organization in general in order to actualize, let's say, an attempt to carry out an armed overthrow of a government. And so after 2011, you start to see the flow of those arms through U.S. covert programs. And I want to emphasize about that, that some people have argued against my position, making a couple of points. They'll say, well, it's a simplification and not a very sophisticated view of U.S. imperialism to just say that, oh, the CIA took out the Syrian government. To which I would respond with a couple of things. First of all, the CIA, we know it's successfully taken out governments in the past, so it's not like it's incapable of this. But in the case of Syria, it's a lot more than that. They contributed what we know beyond the black budgets. This was reported in the New York Times, that there was, and this is some years ago, a quote-unquote billion-dollar covert program, Operation Timber Sycamore, dedicated to supporting these, as they were vaguely called in the press, these rebel militia against the Syrian Arab Republic. So you have the CIA involved with probably its heaviest investment in a sustained covert campaign since Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Operation Cyclone. Okay, so it's not a minor investment that the CIA was making. On top of that, there were other U.S. agencies that eventually get involved in the dismemberment of the Syrian state. There was a State Department program. There was the Pentagon had its own program. So all of these, and then even private contractors after the U.S. direct occupation of Syria starts to take place in 2017, there are contractors that start to get involved. But then even on top of that, you have to add the personnel and materiel operating out of Turkey, out of Jordan to the south, and also a number of the monarchies in the Gulf, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. In some ways, they even had their own competition going to support their various, the rebel groups that they particularly endorsed in the war. So all you have to think in terms of that, all of that combined for a sustained campaign from 2011 to 2024 led to a war of draining, essentially, against the Syrian state. And then, another thing that criticism I received, when I started to look into this is, well, there are a lot of these internal social problems that existed within Syria, in how the Syrian Arab Republic was governing the country, And so, this is, I think, gets down to the question of agency of the people who were involved or flocking towards these militia groups, some of which I acknowledge, yes, were Syrian, not all of them, but some. And so the argument is that by emphasizing this covert program, I am saying that those social dynamics internal to Syria are epiphenomenal. And I would argue in return, I actually take the internal dynamics and the problems and failures of the Syrian government during these years very seriously. But here's the key point. The intelligence agencies were the organizing force for these elements that form the rebel groups to develop some kind of cohesion. That is, if not for the umbrella that they provided in all these various forms, which extends even to propaganda. I mean, the existence of this sectarian ideology was not just something that just arose, quote unquote, organically. Sectarianism was actually a commodity sold on a capitalist market. What I mean is, after 1991, when Syria has to start bringing in outside investors to the country, one of the major markets of a country is going to be media, right? What kind of media stations are being broadcast somewhere, right? That's an act of outside investment, and it's not something that didn't exist prior to 1991. So when people start to watch, these Salafi channels beaming into the country from Egypt or from the Gulf and these private companies, that is something that's a result, again, of a capitalist market. So I try to take the discussion back to these things. It's like, well, these forces just don't, people use organic versus inorganic and this kind of debate. Well, everything's structured to some extent by the economic system in which it's embedded. Now, to return to another element of your question, I think that part of what you're saying is people think, well, the United States was claimed that it was declaring this war against Al-Qaeda or other organizations similar to that. How could it be that it was also providing weapons to these forces? Well, it's not the first time in history that they did that. I remember some people in the 2010s were arguing, yes, that happened in Afghanistan through Operation Cyclone, but the United States learned its lesson from blowback. And I think that actually the United States sees this as a very, that is the sectarian current as a very useful destabilization force. And when we're seeing that play out in some ways, because people will bring up instances of conflict or violence where the United States carries out an attack on ISIS location or something else. Well, the United States has used these groups successfully to shatter the Syrian state, which is directly connected to the fabric of Syrian society, as I was describing. And it also, as we see continued sectarian attacks, makes it very easy for the country to exist as Israel's plaything. Every time that one of these Takfiri groups goes to attack, Alawis in Latakia, or goes to Sueda to attack the Druze, this is another segment of the population that cannot therefore be mobilized in a common front against Israel. So it makes it very easy for Israel to exercise de facto sovereignty over Syrian land. And every time there's another land grab by Israel, every 100 kilometers that is taken away from Syria, or even just 1 kilometer, that is now land that weakens the position vis-a-vis Israel, of Syria vis-a-vis Israel for the future, because that's land that could have been used for, directing water resources in the way that they see fit for their own development, or land that they could have used for training cadres against Israel, so on and so forth. Land is very operative. So I would say that the United States to its actual overall plan for the region, does not see these groups as a serious threat, because once they begin to govern, because of this sectarian streak, it's almost as if they're constitutionally incapable of uniting the resources and peoples of this society against US power.
Yeah, I think I mean, and we are anticipating some things that are very relevant to talk about in the more contemporary and recent context. But those are, it seems to me that there is a couple of things going on here that I'm so glad you discussed. One, of course, is the 90s and 2000s. Two things. One, the pressure that the Syrian state was under as a result of no longer having certain kinds of support from the Soviet Union, and as a result, it had to seek new solutions for trying to maintain some sense of sovereignty and economic health. But it is, also it has been under sanctions of various kinds throughout that period. And then, of course, those were only increased in, more recent times, which have suffocated the possibilities for, indigenous Syrian, economic development, right? So that's been completely hampered, and all because it didn't do several things. One, it didn't normalize with Israel. It didn't end its support for Palestinian resistance factions that you talked about were kept alive in some sense during the Oslo period by being able to organize and exist and receive some material support and organizational capacity in Syria, and to bridge between, the older tradition of these resistance movements and groups and organizations into, forging connections with, what emerged with Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and so on. So that was like one thing, that since it didn't do that, it was going to continue to be isolated, under pressure, and have sanctions against them, but also because they maintained some kind of closer diplomatic relationship with Iran, and therefore were providing some kind of connection between Iran and southern Lebanese resistance forces, particularly Hezbollah. So these things, kind of made it a target, kept it under this kind of pressure. And there was this kind of weakening, as you're pointing out, of the, its position in the global economy, ended up weakening some of those social structures that had kept those relationships that you were saying between popular social forces and the government, right? So that was certainly going to weaken and induce, along with the media and propaganda, liberalizing the media and propaganda in the region and beaming in all of this, kind of ideology that sectarianized. Now, that's the other component that I think is very important that you mentioned, which is that the logics of sectarianism fit very well in the kind of neoliberal capitalist kind of destroying of structures of solidarity and support. And so it ends up, weakening what you might say the kind of collective project, and makes it easier to manipulate. And so that has manifested itself, of course, in the situation where sectarian division in Syria, as a result of the Takfiri, jihadi kind of extreme Sunni, orientation of the government, and the targeting of Druze, Alawis, Christians, and any group that falls outside of this, is actually serves kind of the imperial interests in the region. Partly in the way that it kind of justifies intervention. As, oh my God, there's a extremist, persecutory, barbaric government, happens to be doing a lot of things that we supported it to do in the initial phases, but it also justifies, Israel claiming well, look, we've got these terrorists right on our border, and so we have to find proxies. We have to bombard them. We can't, it's impossible to imagine a Syria under HTS that would have a major military capability or air defense capability. And so they took the opportunity to destroy those capacities in December 2024 with all of the bombing. So I think you're absolutely right that there is a kind of vicious circle, that either Syria is under a government that's pro-Western and been controlled and subordinated to the Zio-American project, or it's chaotic and incapable really of governing and provides all the justification that's needed for dismembering it, for fragmenting it, or for intervening against it, and so on. So these are the kind of these aren't either or choices. They both help serve the imperial project in the region. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but
there's something I would. I think you're absolutely right, and I think one thing that I would add is it's actually remarkable to me. I don't think if you're right that it serves as a pretext, right? To say we're protecting the Druze. This is what Israel claims before it, carries out this or that strike or attempts this or that land grab. But I think what's remarkable about it is how little effort Israel even really is putting into selling it. I mean, I don't know if too many people really believe that. In fact, the only quarters where I come across this idea as legitimate are these sectarian quarters that are claiming the Druze are all pawns of Israel and Zionism. Historically, by the way, that's not true. Yes, there are Druze in Israel who serve in the IDF and so on and so forth. But if you look at the history of the occupied Golan, in 1981, when the Israeli Knesset made a decision there to annex this territory, by and large, since then, they haven't been able to really bring a majority of Druze and commit to Israeli citizenship, even though the option's there. And actually, there are stories of, because there were Druze families that were separated in that area, there's stories of Syrian Druze going to the let's say the high points, the summits in the area, to try to yell out to their relatives to be heard. So the occupation there is not seen favorably by Druze population. So the only people I see really selling the story that Israel's really there to protect the Druze population are those quarters who are trying to make it seem as if the Druze are Israeli puppets, which I think is an unbelievable claim given the history of the sectarian militia's collaboration with the intelligence, these various intelligence agencies over the past decade and plus. One thing I would add to it is Ahmed al-Shara, who's the head of HTS, he's put himself in a position to be in a dependent position here. Mm-hmm. Let's say we don't want to speculate on what's going on in his head, okay? And regardless of whatever he's thinking, that if he decides right now to pursue some different path, which is not, he comes from HTS, he comes from this ideological world. He's not somebody who understands or who believes in rather national liberation, as I was describing in the 20th century. But leaving that aside, his options are limited by this dependent position into which he's put himself. And you might argue, well, okay, after any revolution, because let's using that term as a device here, after any overthrow of a government, let's say, there's going to be a period of instability. But the question is, what is the ideology of the forces that have gained power in the state? That is, are they comparable to, say, the Bolsheviks in 1917, who saw a need to create a union of republics who have the rights given in the Constitution, this right to self-determination, which was actually a means to try to bring these smaller nations into an overall fabric to create something bigger, which was what the Soviet Union is, how it gets out of this perilous situation it found itself in the 1910s and 1920s. No, you have an ideology in power that is actually more comparable to the whites in 1917 and afterwards, the whites being, pogromists and so on. These are pogroms that they're carrying out. And, I've watched a good amount of footage. Unfortunately, I mean, it's very distressing. And, but I feel as a researcher, it's somewhat necessary to get an idea of what we're dealing with. So it's depressing, it's dejecting to see this. But a lot of the groups that are being operationalized by the state, through the state in Sueda, are, you'll see in a lot of the footage, some of them will throw on the bandana or wear the patch of ISIS. So we're thinking to ourselves, where did this belief system that was now armed throughout the 2010s, where did it go? Well, it regathered and reorganized in Idlib, then launched that blitzkrieg attack in December of 2024. And now many of the people who were part of those movements, including, if you remember the group that beheaded a Palestinian child some years ago that had received support from the State Department. They were part of the
Nuruddin Zangi Brigade.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right. They were part of this coalition that HTS was bringing back together in Idlib. So these people didn't go away, and now that they actually have the resources of what's left of the Syrian state backing them.
Yes, I mean, I think that touches upon a number of key points. I think as well. I mean, we saw, for example, from the from the outset that Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, now rebranded as Ahmed al-Shara, who knows what his real name is, but he made these statements on officials in the government, which, of course, the interim government that's completely unelected, but has now been kind of recognized in some sense more broadly by other countries, both in the region and, of course, in the West, have made statements about how they didn't intend to be in direct confrontation with Israel during this period, even though Israeli forces expanded their occupation of territory in the Golan, Golan Heights and beyond, and even declared that all the sort of territory south of Damascus's suburbs was had to be a demilitarized zone. Despite the bombing and attacks of all the kind of infrastructure, and particularly military infrastructure and resources, including the, naval, facilities in Latakia, Ladiqiyah, and so on. Despite all of that, they said, well, we don't have a problem, with Israel. We can come to some agreement with them. We share an enemy, i.e., this trumps all of the other kind of questions or problems in Iran, essentially, is what they were arguing. So there was a purely sectarianized sort of policy here that put Syria in a completely subordinate position to Israeli military and security dictates, and that they would find their place within it. And so they're clearly totally subordinate to that. This has, of course, been, I think a crucial point. And of course, many apologists for the so-called revolution have said, well, of course, it's early stages. They can't be, kind of expected to take on like this incredibly powerful military after just taking over the country. But what we've seen is that kind of policy has been continuing to its logical conclusions, which is trying to bargain away everything that had prevented Syria from having normal relations with the rest of the world because of U.S. sanctions, to bargain away everything that had prevented that, which was that you have to give up, any connection with Iran and no support for Hezbollah. The first thing that it seems that this government managed to accomplish, apart from harassing, attacking, massacring, killing, and burning, areas, where there were Alawis or Christians, etc., was that they liquidated all of the Palestinian resistance organizations. Like, so the first thing, and that was one of the other things that they were supposed to, the Syrian state was always being asked to give up their support for and material support for Palestinian resistance factions. So, geopolitically, it's sort of clear, what its orientation. And I think, like you, I don't think that any of the propaganda is actually working, quite so well. But there are some other kind of components that I wanted to talk about in this context. One is the position of these other regional kind of actors and sponsors as well, and what you make of this. Because Syria, of course, as a consequence of that decade of devastation and sanctions and everything, has been under U.S. occupation in parts of the country. There has been kind of the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they've been called, that are operating in the Deir ez-Zor sort of area and are based on, YPG or various Kurdish militias and groups. And so there's, and these have their different sponsors, and you already alluded to that many of the different armed factions that were, combating the Syrian army and fighting to overthrow the government were supported by different sort of Gulf state monarchies and so on. I'm wondering, how you see this situation. Obviously, the key patrons were the state, Turkey, as like direct sort of patrons of the Idlib, governorate and the groups there. But now there's like a lot of talk about how this has brought Turkey and Israel into, potential conflict. There's talk about, the March agreement that was made, to enroll the Syrian Democratic Forces into the new Syrian kind of army, and various other, kinds of concessions in this kind of agreement. I'm wondering how you see, what's been happening in Syria and the prospects for maintaining any kind of integrated Syrian sovereignty. I'll note, just recently, there's been news reports about a proposed David corridor to link, Sueda and the sort of southern areas around the Golan to those exactly those areas near Deir ez-Zor, where the Syrian Democratic Forces, have had kind of some kind of autonomy and so on. And Turkey, of course, has objected strenuously to this, claiming that, this is terrible for Syria's sovereignty. I mean, the ironies here are just unbelievable. But I'm wondering, how would you characterize the last several months, since the 2024 December 2024 overthrow of the previous government, from this kind of regional perspective? What's changed as a result of this in terms of kind of regional alignments and their interventions in Syrian politics?
Well, you putting a fine point on the issue of Turkey is important, because in my own writings and approach, I've emphasized the United States and Israel the most. But if you look at it from the perspective of the Ba'ath Party historically, for instance, they viewed Turkey as one of the major threats to Syrian sovereignty and Syrian unity from the beginning, because in 1939, Turkey had taken over Skanderun in the north of the country. And it was in that territory that one of the founders of the Ba'ath Party, I mentioned him earlier, Arsuzi, that he was a Ba'ath Party organizer in that territory. And this informed his sense of Arab nationalist consciousness. Now, many of these groups, the SDF you mentioned, east of the country, are ideologically, they're many ways opposed to the program of the various Takfiri groups, but they do find themselves in a similar kind of structural issue insofar as a lot of their umbrella of protection after 2015 had depended on the United States, which had come to, first launched a major bombing campaign and then sent its Marines into the country to take over the oil fields in the areas that you mentioned. And this was something that was done strategically because they knew if they took over these oil fields, they would be able to blackmail the Syrian government and say, well, you're not going to get back the source of internal revenue until you sever your ties with the various Palestinian resistant groups as well as Hezbollah. So what we are witnessing, I think, in some sense, is a, say, carve-up, more or less, that you have these three separate areas. And I don't think, I try to not, I try to be careful or measured with predictions and so on and so forth. But the United States military presence there is in the east, where the SDF is based, is there to protect the interests of American companies that are now going to enter Syria. And there are various Turkish companies that are entering Syria through the north. And then I'm sure, Israel, of course, is working towards some sort of normalization where they get direct investment as well and opening up companies. So I think that is what I think people should pay attention to, is because when even though Syria had been from 1991 through 2025, its territorial sovereignty had been significantly compromised, and its socialism that existed prior to 1991 had been significantly compromised. There were still, these public services, public programs that existed. Now, what was left of that is essentially been shattered and is going to be purchased, auctioned off to companies from those three countries. So if you want to understand the policy, follow those companies. And even earlier, I was looking at some of the American companies that now, because they're in the country's energy-rich, oil and gas-rich areas of Syria, are going to be tasked with managing the energy plan for Syria. And actually, these companies exist right outside my door. I mean, one of them is Baker Hughes, which is based out of Houston, Texas. The other is Hunt Energy, which is based in Dallas, Texas. So, and this is something that is, I have direct experience with, because the energy companies in Texas, it's an unregulated market, as it will be over in Syria. And since there's no price caps from the state, which, by the way, was a major part of the Syrian constitution I was citing earlier, is that price fixing was an important part of nationalization in that constitution. That does not exist with Texas energy companies. Is that, it all of a sudden gets a few degrees hotter outside, and there's no limit to what your bill's going to look like. So these are now the companies that are going to be managing Syria's energy policy. It's not coming internally from Syria itself. I saw my friend and comrade Louis Alday had sent me something earlier about the Turkish and Qatari companies that are involved. And actually, it looks like they're shell companies. I mean, this is something I just started looking into. But as far as the construction works going on around the country, as well as in the airport, for example, shell companies without history, which is, I'm familiar with that just living in Texas, how that works. When you're in a wild west of the capitalist market, all of a sudden, I mean, you should see during COVID, some of these shell companies that had been started up, that they started sending to schools to do testing. And, I remember at one school, they had gathered people's spit sample to see who had COVID. And then because they were throwing it in garbage bags, they drove off. and the mucus from all the samples had gotten mixed together, so it was all for naught. So I just give that. I know it's a little off track, but I give that example to give a vivid idea of what a shell company actually looks like and the kind of services that you can expect. So yes, there is a carve up in the companies from these three countries: United States, which is in the east, Israel, which is occupying the south, and Turkey, which is occupying the north, are going to be competing for different pieces of the Syrian state that will be picked apart into smaller and smaller segments of a market for more profit. So more of these companies can pick up, some aspect of a major service.
Yeah, so that's like the political economic foundations for, at a political and cultural level, fragmentation of the country around sort of regional, differences and distinctions. A Kurdish northeast, a kind of northwestern coastal, Alawi zone, Druze and Arab tribes, in the south. And so, that will just mirror what you're talking about, are these kind of arenas for exploitation in the reconstruction. And so I think what we've talked about here is the way in which the imperial, design in the region privileges military spending, pitting, kind of making security this kind of key point, and then having war, destruction, chaos, and then profiting from, as you say, the carve up and the reconstruction as much as the buildup. And the cycle of kind of chaos and devastation is, in fact, actually a kind of pattern of its de-development and then so-called redevelopment, of the region with its political, economic consequences for reshaping the region. So I really want to thank you very much for all of this analysis and encourage you in your ongoing kind of research and investigation of this kind of process of the corporate exploitation and the economic kind of future of Syria, and how this coordinates with what we've been talking about here in this longer historical context and framework of the situation of Syria. Where can people keep track of your work, or stay in touch with you on social media, or anything you want to share and promote? In addition, of course, that we will all be looking out for more studies on the Syrian situation. What would you like to promote to people?
In addition to the article that you recommended, Gunning for Damascus, on Syria in particular, the most recent things that I put out, recommend people go to Ebb Magazine to see a Q&A that I did with Louis Alday about Syria, where I talk about some of these issues in detail. And also on the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective website, I have a new article there that is not solely about Syria, but places Syria into recent regional context since October 7th, 2023. That article is called Acts of Return: How the Al-Aqsa Flood Shattered the U.S. Fantasy of Full Spectrum Dominance. So Acts of Return, Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. And so you could read some more analysis that, again, this is an ongoing process. And one last comment I'll just make about the Syrian issue, that this is an unresolved remnant still. It's not an issue where, for many, not just for Syria itself, but for the Palestine solidarity movement in the United States, for global forces of the left, it's not like Assad's gone and all of a sudden the issue is resolved. We've entered a new phase. And in this phase, the issue of anti-sectarianism is going to be the development of an anti-sectarian organized force is going to be essential in Syria, because what happens in Syria to a significant degree historically has dictated what is possible in Palestine. And what we're seeing now is almost, we understand that there's a program of extermination in Gaza against a population of the global proletariat that has been deemed, quote unquote, surplus to the global economy. What we're seeing in Syria is some segments of, let's say, the lower classes, even though they're largely lumpen, exterminating other segments in the coast of Latakia and Sueda. And that is something that my comrade Obi Dinar was pointing out when I was talking to him earlier, is the depressing prospect of witnessing a new kind of enactment, a new manifestation of extermination of the proletariat as a source of profit. And this is why I think Syria remains of paramount significance.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. And I think it's, I fully endorse the point that there has to be active resistance to the sectarianization of politics in the region, and for Syria, if Syria is to have, a future for its people, that is one that they would look forward to, rather than the sort of chaotic hellscape of sectarian division and chaos that is being sponsored for, as you point out, the advancing exploitation and eradication of the surplus populations. And this is the whole thing, is that what we've seen in Gaza is the making of the Palestinian. It's a demonstration sort of effect. We've heard even Gustavo Petro, president of Colombia, at the Hague Convention, make a very important speech where he declared, that what we're seeing in Gaza is what the ultra-rich have planned, for those who want to resist on behalf of humanity, is that those populations will be liquidated. And if we accept what's happening in Palestine, which is this ethno-states kind of narrow definition of who has political rights, who's a citizen, even who's human, then this logic is going to reproduce itself, and is reproducing itself throughout the region. So I thank you so much for identifying that as one of the key stakes that are involved in the Syria situation, because as we know, a lot of people in the pro-Palestine movement who would recognize that analysis when we talk about Zionism and its genocidal attack on Palestinians, nonetheless can sometimes get confused about what's really at stake and what the alignment of forces are when it comes to other regional theaters, because they've accepted some of the logic of, sectarianization. And so that's, I think, very important. And I thank you again so much for the work that you're doing. And we will link to the Ebb magazine article, also something that you should be subscribing to and supporting people, a wonderful kind of resource, and also to your recent and wonderful piece in the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective website. We will put links to those in the description so that people can keep reading and stay connected with the important analysis that you're offering. So again, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Adnan.
And for listeners and watchers of the video, we'll be back with many more kinds of discussions like this for political and public education. So stay tuned, like, subscribe, and share. Subscribe to the channel, share.